Personally, I believe honoring the Sabbath is a wonderful experience if the motive of your heart is correct. You see, if the motive of your heart is wrong, which we see often in the Bible, and that's what Jesus was encountering, is that these people, their heart wasn't right when it came to the law. When it came to the fourth commandment, their heart was wrong. And so when that happens, the law turns into legalism. You've heard of legalism? Biblical legalism is the belief that your works, your obedience will earn God's favor. That by what you do, you will make God happy. That's the total opposite of grace, which is what we sang about today. That amazing grace. There's nothing we can do to earn God's favor. If there's at any point in your heart, you begin to believe or you begin to think to yourself, boy, if I just do this for God, if I honor the Sabbath, God's going to be happy with me, then your heart is wrong. And you've got to change your heart. Jesus was confronted by these Pharisees continually about the Sabbath. I mean, there's two incidences here in the synoptic gospels. We say synoptic meaning the same. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all write similarly, and that's why we say they're the synoptic gospels. And the story of this Sabbath appears in all Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And Luke is where we're at, so we're reading from Luke. But in this situation, they stack up these Sabbath incidences, right? That Jesus did this on the Sabbath, and he did this on the Sabbath, and there those Pharisees were. They were picking on him about how he was dealing with the Sabbath, because the Sabbath was a big deal. It's the center of life for Judaism. And so now in this particular case, the first incident, what did the disciples do? Well, they were walking with Jesus, most likely. If you ever watched The Chosen, I think I remember there was an episode where this happened, and Peter grabbed some grain and he rubbed it in his hands to get the grain out, and he began to eat it, and then he realized, I'm working on the Sabbath. I'm doing work. You're not supposed to do that. And Jesus said, don't worry about it. It's okay. I know a guy. I just made that part out, okay. But this is what was going on, and these Pharisees, these religious leaders, remember Pharisees means separated ones. They were trying to separate themselves from everybody else, being very pious and obedient to the law and be perfect about it. And these Pharisees found out that they had done this. And I thought to myself, when you meditate on Scripture and you think about it, it's like, wait a minute. If Jesus was out with his disciples and they were just kind of walking through a field and they did this, how did the Pharisees know that? I mean, these guys, are they hiding in the bushes? I mean, do you remember the game Whack-A-Mole at Chuck E. Cheese? You remember that game? How many of you played Whack-A-Mole at Chuck E. Cheese or Major Magics or whatever? You get this big, I know, Major Magics, I'm going way back, right? You get this big mallet, right? And you're basically got this table. If you've never played Whack-A-Mole, okay, it's fun, all right? It gets a little aggressive, though, let's be honest. But these little moles, they pop up, and then you're supposed to whack them on the head, right, with this mallet. And I used to love watching the dads play this game on a Saturday morning, because they're just mad they got to be there, right? I mean, 100 screaming kids, why am I here on a Saturday morning? When does football start? And they're not trying to hit the mole. They're trying to shatter his head completely so he never comes back. Whack-a-mole. Well, that's what I feel like, that's what I see in Scripture. I see these Pharisees. They're just popping up everywhere. Everywhere Jesus is, these whack-a-moles, they're popping up. What was Jesus' response to the disciples doing work on the Sabbath by eating on the Sabbath? They were hungry, and so they did a little bit of work to get some food. Well, Jesus responded with a biblical answer. And I think that's really important for us to know, that if you are going to make big decisions in life, you're going to make any decisions, do you have a biblical reason for doing that? Do you have a biblical example that can back up your decision? And Jesus reminds us that he does that all the time. And his example is David. he goes right to King David, who they revered. All Jewish people revere King David because they know from David comes the Messiah. And what did David do when he was hungry? David was on the run. Saul was trying to kill him, the first king. And David was on the run, and he shows up to the house of God, and he's there, and he sees the priest, and he says, "We're hungry. What do you got to eat?" And he says, "I don't have anything. All I have is what is always in the house of God." If you go back to Exodus, when we went through the book of Exodus, and you walk into the temple, and on the table of showbread, the table is the bread of the presence, they call it. And there's 12 loaves there, 12 pieces of bread, one for each. And they're big. I mean, if you've ever seen, they're big. I mean, there's a lot of bread there. We all love our bread, don't we? Yes. And so there's these 12 loaves or pieces of bread there, but they're only for the priests. Because what happens is on Shabbat, they come in, they replace them, and they eat the old bread. And so that's what David ate, because he was hungry and all his men were hungry. And the priest said you could do it under these conditions. But if you read the Bible, the whole Bible, and you've come across different situations, you know that sometimes God judges people for what they do harshly and instantaneously. It's like you did this, boom, this is coming down on you. Remember guys like Nadab and Abihu? They offered unauthorized fire, and they were killed immediately. They were judged immediately. God also struck down Phinehas and Ferb for their wickedness. I'm kidding, it's Phinehas and Hophni, but our younger generation likes those cartoons, so I got to bring in a little Phinehas and Ferb. Keep them engaged, right? Why didn't God strike down David? Well, he says David was a man after my own heart. So God knows his heart. And he also knows the purpose and the heart of the Shabbat. Jesus sums up the reasoning in Luke 6:5. Jesus said to these Pharisees, when his reasoning is ultimately, he gives the example, and then he says this, "Look it, I am the Lord of the Sabbath." But he doesn't call himself the Messiah. He says the Son of Man. He often refers to himself as the Son of Man, which was a term for the coming Messiah. The Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. Fellas, I'm the boss of the command. That's what Lord means. It means boss. I'm the boss of this command. I was with my dad when he gave the command to Moses on the stone tablets. I was there. I know what the heart of this commandment is. I understand it. You don't get it. In fact, in Mark chapter 2, verse 27, Mark, again, same story, but Mark adds this little detail that Jesus said. He said that Jesus said, "The Sabbath was made for the man, not the man for the Sabbath."